Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell. For those of you new to this channel, I cover all things Platonism. I've done many videos on Plato's dialogues, and I also cover other philosophers in this tradition, such as this series on Proclus's Elements of Theology. Now, the Elements of Theology is one of Proclus's most famous works. Here, he broke down the metaphysics from the first principle all the way down to the level of soul. He broke it down into 211 propositions, and he goes methodically and logically through them. So this is going to be a rather long series because there are 211 of these propositions. But what I'm going to do is sometimes I'll block a bunch of them together if I think they fit together and it's proper for them to be looked at together. Today, for example, I'm going to look at 1 through 5. Other days, though, I may only look at 1 or 2 propositions if I think that a little more explanation is required in order to really understand what's going on there. I will be using the E.R. Dodds translation. It's probably the most famous one that is out there. For those of you who do not have it, I will put a link in the description box for a PDF version of it. And with that introduction, let me jump now to the first proposition. Let me just move the text so that my face is not covering it. Okay, so what he starts us off with here is that every manifold in some way participates unity. I want to make 2 notes here first about the word participates and also about the word unity. So participates, if we look at the Greek, for those of you who can read a little Greek, it's here in green here, metike. Sometimes the last 2 characters will change depending on the grammar, but if you will recognize these first 5 characters repeated many places, such as right here, for example, right underneath it with different grammar. But the idea of participation is one that you want to keep thinking about and keep returning to. He's not giving us here the mechanics of it, and so there's room for a lot of misunderstanding, and we need to. It's one of those words that even philosophers who've been doing this for many years still come back and question what exactly does it mean to participate. So it's okay to have some idea in your mind, but I do recommend that whatever image you have, write it in your mind in pencil because you want to keep changing it and keep adjusting it and allowing it to mature. Also on the word unity, unity has more than one meaning. The Greek here is, I put in here in yellow, to enos, and that's often translated as the one. So the word unity can sometimes mean a manifold that has come together into one, such as our body is made up of many parts that function together as a unity. Here, however, unity is being used in a pure sense, like the one. And so it's very important to see that, otherwise it's quite confusing. Okay, so now the propositions, what you see here is that he presents it first as just one sentence. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 sentences, but it's always quite short. And then there's an explanation of it. And so all 211 propositions are set up this way. So proposition 1 is that every manifold in some way participates unity. So already we have a subject, verb, and object. The manifold participates unity. And we're going to see him talk about all 3 of those parts. So here he's talking about the unity that every manifold must participate in. So he tells us to suppose a manifold that in no way participates unity. And this is a common way that he argues, that he'll show you that the alternatives to his proposition are impossible, and therefore his proposition must be true. So suppose that we have a manifold, a manyness, a plurality, whatever word you want to use there if manifold doesn't work for you. Suppose that we have a manyness or a manifold that in no way participates unity. So neither this manifold as a whole nor any of its several parts will be one. There can't be any oneness about it if it does not participate unity. Which means that each part will itself be a manifold of parts and so on to infinity. Now he has to show us that this is impossible. So of this infinity of parts, each once more will be infinitely manifold. For a manifold which in no way participates any unity, neither as a whole nor in respect of its parts severally, will be infinite in every way and in respect of every part. Okay, so you can't even break it down really into parts because each part is a one. And so already that would be impossible. But even if we could imagine breaking it into parts, each part would be infinite. But if each part were, for each part of the manifold, take which you will, which is technically impossible, it must either be one or not one. And if it's not one, then it's either many or nothing. But if each part were nothing, then the whole would be nothing, which of course doesn't make any sense. And if it were many, then it's made up of an infinity of infinites. And this is impossible. For on the one hand, nothing which is made up of an infinity of infinites. And then he put there in the parentheses that the infinite cannot be exceeded. Nothing can be greater than infinite. Yet the single part is exceeded by the sum. A part, by definition, is a part of a whole. And the part is always smaller than the whole. But if the part is infinite, nothing can be larger than the infinite, and therefore you have this logical absurdity. On the other hand, nothing can be made up of parts, which are nothing, because then you just have a whole lot of nothing. Every manifold, therefore, in some way participates unity. Okay, so that is the first proposition that everything else is built on. Now, if you would like to see a discussion of that in a little more detail, I'll put a link up above because I did do a video on just the first proposition. It is a really important one to understand. So if you do not understand this one, please check out that video. And now going on to the second proposition. All that participates unity is both one and not one. So we saw why everything must participate unity. Now we're going to see why that which participates is both one and not one. It's not pure unity itself. For inasmuch as it cannot be a pure unity, since participation in unity implies a distinct participant, there must be something participating unity. A participates B. So if you had just a pure unity, it wouldn't be participating. It would just be that. So its participation means that it has unity as an effect, and it has undergone a process of becoming one. So participation, whatever it is, it's still not really clear. It's a process of becoming one, or at least it results in a process of becoming one. Now, if it be nothing else but its own unity, then it's a bare one, and so it cannot participate unity. It must be pure unity, and that's what we saw in Proposition 1. But if it has some character other than oneness, in virtue of that character, it is not one, and so it's not unity unqualified. Okay, so if it's not unity unqualified, and it participates in that unity, then it must be something in some way. It must have some character other than oneness. And so in that regard, it's not one. Thus, being one and yet by participating unity, it's in itself not one, so it's both one and not one. It is in fact unity with something added, and it is in virtue of the addition not one, although it is one as affected by unity through that participation. Everything, therefore, which participates unity is both one and not one. Okay, now moving on from here, he wants to now solidify that participation is the only way for the not one to become one. And so proposition 3 is that all that becomes one does so by participation of unity. For what becomes one is itself not one, but is one inasmuch as it is affected by participation of unity. Since if things which are not in themselves one should become one, they surely do so by coming together and by communication in each other, and so are subjected to the presence of unity, without being unity unqualified. So now we have a little bit more about what participation is, right? Proposition 1 gave us unity. Proposition 2 gave us that which participates it. Proposition 3 then is focusing on that activity, participating. And here we're seeing that whatever it is, whatever the mechanics of it might be, which are not being explained to us, it has to do with this coming together and communication in each other. Insofar then as they undergo a process of becoming one, they participate unity. So that is what is meant by participation. Therefore, for if they already are one, then they cannot become one. Nothing can become what it already is. But if from a former not one, they become one, then their unity must be due to a one which has entered into them. And so that is what we're calling participation. So for the not one to become one, that is that process. There's no other way of becoming one. It is only by participation. Proposition 4 tells us that all that is unified is other than the one itself. Notice here that the language has changed. In Proposition 1, we saw unity, and that was that toenos. Now we have the one itself, and the Greek has also changed. Let me come over here, go up a little bit here. I put it in yellow. To auto enos. Auto, this first 4 characters here is pronounced auto, which means self or sometimes same. And it's often translated here as the one itself. So the self one would literally be how it would break down. And it's usually translated as the one itself. You can also think of it as the one self, in the way that many spiritual traditions, wisdom traditions, talk about the self with a capital S. So we've now moved from talking about to enos to auto enos. So all that is unified, and unified not the same as unity. So you can sometimes use the word unity to talk about that which has come together and is unified. Our bodies function as a unity. He's not using it that way. Again, remember where Dodds used the word unity, he meant it as a pure unity. But he's differentiating that from unified, which is the parts coming together and becoming one. So all that is unified, all that becomes one, is other than the one self or the one itself. For if it is unified, it must in some way participate unity, namely in that respect in which it is said to be unified. And that was Proposition 3. One really nice thing that Dodds does for us is that he's going to reference past propositions. So we're going to see as we go on that Proclus is going to keep referring back to previous propositions. He's building. He's giving us now the early building blocks, and then later he's going to keep building on top of this foundation. And Dodds does a really nice job, a really convenient thing for us of giving us those references back. So here we're seeing that already he's tying everything together. We're only on the 4th, but Proclus is already tying it all together. So going back to the beginning here, if it's unified, it must in some way participate unity, namely in that respect in which it is said to be unified. And what participates unity is both one and not one, and that was Proposition 2. But the one itself is not both one and not one. For if it also were one and not one, then the unity which it contains will in its turn contain this pair of elements, and there'll be an infinite regress. In other words, if the one itself were both one and not one, then it would be becoming one. And so those parts, then the part of it that's not one would have to participate the one, which is both one and not one, which would have to participate the one, which is both one and not one, and it would go on forever. That's not logical. We shall find no simple unity at which our analysis can stop, but everything will be one and not one. The unified, therefore, is something other than the one. Notice he changed the language here. This is toenos, but he didn't call it unity. Now he's using the language the one. For the one, if identical with the unified, will be infinitely manifold, as will also each of the parts which compose the unified. Okay, so the one cannot be identical with the unified. They are different. So we had like A participates B. A and B have to be different. And notice here also that so far he's describing participation as the lower participating in the higher only. Okay, proposition 5. Every manifold is posterior to the one. Okay, so the manifold is the lower and the one is the higher. The lower participates in the higher. First, suppose a manifold were prior to the one. So again, here's that way of arguing. He's going to say that the manifold has to come after the one. And to show this, he's going to show why it's illogical to consider anything else. It can't be that the manifold comes first, and it also can't be that they're equal. So he has to show that both of those possibilities are impossible, and therefore the only thing left is that the manifold must be after the one. Okay, so kind of a Sherlock Holmes logic. So suppose a manifold prior to the one. The one will then participate the manifold. So the lower participating the higher. The one would be participating in the many. But the prior manifold would not be participating the one, seeing that in the first place it exists as manifold before the one comes to be, and it cannot participate what does not exist. So if the manifold is first, it can't participate the one because the one doesn't yet exist. And secondly, because what participates the one is both one and not one, and that was proposition 2. But if the first principle be plurality, if we're imagining the first principle were that manifold, here plurality is synonymous with manifold, then there'd be no one as yet exists, and so how could it participate one? It's impossible there should be a manifold in no way participating the one, and that was the first proposition. So therefore we have to throw this idea out. The manifold is not prior to the one. Okay, now he's going to suppose that we have a manifold that is coexistent with the one. They are both equal in power. They're both equally first principles. And these two principles are coordinate in nature. To their temporal coordination, there is no such objection. Then the one is not in itself many, nor is the manifold one. So they're both completely separate. The one exists as one and not a many. The many exists as many and not one. But they exist side by side as contradistinguished principles, inasmuch as neither is prior or posterior to the other. There's no ranking. They're equal. The manifold, then, will be in itself not one, and each of its parts are not one, and so on to infinity. We already saw in proposition 1 that this is impossible. By its own nature, therefore, it participates the one, and it will be impossible to find any part of it which is not one. If it be not one, it will be an infinite sum of infinites, and we already saw in proposition 1 that that's impossible. Thus, it participates the one in every way. If then that one whose unity is not derivative and in no way participates plurality, the manifold will be in every way posterior to the one, participating the one, but not participated by it. Now, what if we imagine, though, that we have the one that in like manner participates plurality, being indeed one in substance, but by participation not one? So far what he's been showing us is that the lower participates the higher. It goes only one direction. But now he's saying, what if we allowed it to go both ways? What if we did have the one as the higher, but it participates the manifold just as the manifold participates the one? Would that be logical? Let's take a look. So if on the other hand the one in like manner participates plurality, being indeed one in substance, but by participation not one, then the one will be pluralized because of the manifold, as the manifold is unified because of the one. So just as the many becomes one through participation, in this hypothetical the one becomes many through participation in the many. Thus the one communicates in the manifold and the manifold in the one. But things which come together and communicate in each other, if they are brought together by a third principle, they would have that principle as their prior. So if we're imagining these two principles that are equal in power and they participate in each other, he's saying there must be a higher principle that blends them both together. If, on the contrary, they bring themselves together, then there can't be opposites, for opposites do not tend toward opposites. Now, on the supposition that the one and the manifold are contradistinguished, so we're still on that hypothetical, and the manifold qua manifold, quas, I don't know why he uses that, why Dodds uses that. It's a Latin word, and so I don't know why he's bringing in Latin, but it just means as, and maybe he uses it for emphasis, that we're talking about the manifold as manifold. It has an aspect of becoming one, but we're only talking about the manifold as manifold. Okay, I'll go back to the beginning of that sentence. Okay, now on the supposition that the one and the manifold are contradistinguished, and the manifold as manifold is not one, and the one as one is not manifold, it's neither arising within the other, neither one arising within the other, they will be at once one by participation, because they're blended together, they come together, and they're two in substance, they're two different things. But if something prior to both is required to bring them together, then this prior, again, it's either one or not one. And if it's not one, it's either many or nothing. Same logic we saw before. But it cannot be many, or else we have a manifold prior to the one. We've already done away with that. Nor can it be nothing, because how should a nothing draw them together? It is one, therefore, and nothing but one. For plainly this one cannot be many, or we again have that infinite regress. And so here is the conclusion from these first five propositions. And let me highlight this for you. It is then the one itself, and from the one itself, every manifold proceeds. So this is the first principle he's telling us, the one itself. And again, in Greek, that is this to auto enos, which again you can translate as the one self or the one itself. And so I wanted to go through these first five because I think this is a nice, satisfying conclusion that we have reached at the end of Proposition 5, that we see that the one itself, from the one itself, every manifold proceeds. What I recommend doing with these, for those of you who want to really internalize it and really make the most of this, is to sit with these five and really try to visualize it and put them together in your mind, seeing all the parts of it, that which participates, the participation itself, and that which it participates in, and trying to see it all together and really trying to turn it inward. I'll be putting out videos about, I'm aiming for like once every week to 10 days. And so in the time between, it gives you time to really internalize it and sit with it. And as we add to it, we have more to link together, right? We want to link them all together and really see how they fit together. Take it beyond just a discursive academic exercise. I did do a video just previously to this one on doing this very exercise of internalizing it and getting the most out of the reading. And I purposely did that video before this because I know that it would be helpful for a study as in-depth as this one. And so I'm going to link that video at the end. And I do recommend thinking about, trying to do this. And it really will help you internalize it and get more out of these, especially as we go on and we have many, many more propositions that we're adding to it and we're trying to link them all together. My next video then will be on propositions 6 and 7. These are two very key ones, and so I'm going to give you some diagrams and give you a little more to go with that as well, because those two are really key to understand, and then that will really give us a good basis on which we're building everything else. So if you like what you're seeing here, please give it a like. It really does help the algorithm. And if you have any questions or comments, you could put those in the comments section below. And if you don't already subscribe, I do hope that you will do so. And I hope that you'll join me next week. Thank you very much.